Imagine trusting your life to a machine that was already considered obsolete before you were born. Not outdated in the casual sense, not old but serviceable. Obsolete on paper. Written off. Scrapped. Sold for parts. And yet, on a hot morning, in June of 1967, hundreds of tank crews climbed into those machines anyway. They closed heavy steel hatches. They've checked engines built in a different era. They loaded ammunition designed for guns that never existed when these holes were first cast. And then they drove directly toward enemy forces equipped with newer, heavier, more powerful tanks machines that were supposed to make their own irrelevant. On paper, this should have been a massacre instead. It became one of the most unlikely success stories in military history. Short pause to understand how that happened. You have to rewind decades earlier, to a very different war, fought on very different continents. When the United States entered World War II, it faced a problem no nation had ever solved at that scale. It didn't just need good tanks, it needed tens of thousands of tanks. They had to be built fast, repaired easily, shipped across oceans, and operated by soldiers who might only have weeks of training. American planners made a decision that would shape the future in ways they never anticipated. They chose reliability over brilliance. The result was the M4 Sherman. It was not the most powerful tank of the war. It was not the most heavily armored. It was not the most intimidating. But it could be built anywhere, fixed almost anywhere, and kept running by mechanics with basic tools. Factories designed for cars and locomotives were converted almost overnight. Components were standardized so completely that parts from one Sherman could fit another, even if they were built by different companies thousands of miles apart. If a transmission failed, it could be swapped. If a track broke, replacements were interchangeable. That sounds mundane. In war, it's everything. Paul's Sherman had flaws, and the men who fought in it knew them well. Its armor was thinner than German heavy tanks. Early guns struggled against newer enemy designs. Gasoline engines had a reputation for fire when penetrated. Crews joked darkly about it, because humor was often the only defense against fear. And yet, when tigers broke down and panthers failed to reach the battlefield, kept rolling. They crossed bridges heavier tanks couldn't. They fit on ships others couldn't board. They arrived in numbers that overwhelmed more sophisticated designs. By 1945, nearly 50,000 had been built. Then the war ended, and the Sherman was supposed to disappear. Instead it spread. Poor's surplus tanks were sold, stored, scrapped, and forgotten. Rows of Shermans rusted in depots. Others were shipped to allies who couldn't afford newer designs. Many were cut apart, their engines destroyed, their guns removed, their hulls left to decay. On paper, the Sherman's story was over. Reality disagreed. The first warning came in Korea, in 1950. North Korean forces surged south with Soviet-built tanks that had dominated Europe only years earlier. American infantry units found themselves helpless. Their anti-tank weapons failed. Requests for armored support were met with a grim truth. There were no modern tanks available, so commanders looked backward. They found Sherman. Late war variants were pulled from storage, repaired, and rushed to the front. Crews had minimal preparation. Nobody knew how these tanks would perform against newer Soviet designs. The answer came quickly, with improved ammunition, better optics, and disciplined crews. Shermans began holding their own. They weren't invulnerable, but they could fight. And in war, presence often matters more than perfection. By the end of the year, hundreds were back in service. A tank declared obsolete was winning battles again. Pause. But the Sherman's most remarkable transformation didn't happen in Korea. It happened in Israel. The newly formed nation faced a brutal reality. It was surrounded by hostile neighbors. Its economy was fragile. Foreign arms supplies were uncertain, or politically restricted. Buying hundreds of modern tanks was simply impossible. So Israeli planners did something unconventional. They went looking for junk. Agents scoured Europe for abandoned armor. In scrapyards across Italy and beyond, they found Sherman hulls wrecked, sabotaged, stripped of anything valuable. Tanks no one else wanted. Tanks that were supposed to be melted down. They bought them anyway. What followed was not a factory program, it was improvisation on a national scale. Mechanics stripped the tanks to bare steel. Engines were rebuilt or replaced. Guns were scavenged, adapted, or fabricated. Entire systems were redesigned without original blueprints, without manufacturer support, without access to the resources major Powers took for granted. Every tank became an individual project, and then they hit the wall, every engineer eventually. Faces. Firepower. By the 1950s, neighboring states were receiving Soviet tanks with thicker armor and bigger guns. The original Sherman weapons simply weren't enough. In a direct fight, they would lose. Buying replacements wasn't an option, so Israeli engineers asked a question no one else dared to ask. What if we changed the gun? The idea sounded insane. Mounting a modern high-velocity cannon into a World War II turret meant fighting, recoil, space constraints, balance issues, and structural limits that the original designers never intended to be tested. But necessity has a way of lowering the threshold of impossible. French guns were selected, turrets were modified, barrels were shortened, massive muzzle brakes were added to tame recoil, ammunition was redesigned to fit cramped interiors. Engines were replaced with diesel power plants. Suspensions were upgraded. Fire risk was reduced. What emerged barely resembled the original tank. These machines looked strange. Oversized guns, taller profiles, external storage, welded wherever space allowed. No two were exactly alike. But they worked. When war came again, first in 1956 and then in 1967, these modified Shermans went to the front. Against prepared defenses, against minefields, against Soviet supplied armor that was newer, heavier, and supposedly superior. They didn't win because they were better. They won because their crews understood them completely. PAR's training mattered. Terrain mattered. Leadership mattered. In the Sinai, these tanks punched through fortified positions that were meant to stop them. On the Golan Heights, they engaged enemy armor dug into defensive lines. In urban fighting, they supported infantry in conditions their designers never imagined. For a brief window in history, ingenuity closed the gap between generations of technology, but time always moves forward. In 1973, the battlefield changed again. New missiles appeared. New guns fired faster, farther, and with greater precision. Air defenses limited support from above. The old hulls could no longer protect their crews the way they once had. Losses mounted. Veterans who survived knew the truth before planners admitted it. The Sherman had finally reached the end of its frontline service. Long pause, but even then, it refused to disappear. Those tanks moved into reserves. They were transferred to allies. They appeared in civil wars, border standoffs, and internal conflicts around the world. They fought in cities, deserts, jungles, and mountains. Some guarded borders into the 21st century. The last Shermans remained in active service until 2018, 73 years after the war they were built for had ended. That fact alone tells you something important. The Sherman was never the best tank in any conflict it fought. Not in World War II, not in Korea, not in the Middle East, not anywhere. But it was the most adaptable that could be maintained by ordinary mechanics. It could be modified without factory support. It could accept engines, guns, and systems from entirely different nations and still function. Its designers aimed for adequacy, and in doing so, they accidentally created one of the longest-serving armored vehicles in history. The Sherman's real legacy isn't found in armor thickness charts or penetration tables. It's found in workshops where mechanics refused to accept that something was finished, in crews who trusted machines older than themselves, in nations that kept fighting because good enough was all they had, and they made it work. History loves revolutionary technology, but wars are often won by reliability, adaptability, and people who refuse to give up on what they have. The Sherman endured because it allowed that. And long after more impressive machines vanished, it was still there, rolling, fighting, adapting. Final pause.